just a signal bouncing off the rocks of the Varen passage like something had been waiting a long time for someone to finally pass close enough to hear it. Hara Osai heard it. She always heard things other people ignored. She was 51 years old, built like someone who had spent decades in low gravity and fought her way back to normal bone density through sheer stubbornness. Her hands were rough. Her jacket was older than most of her crew. She had bought the UHS Resolute from a salvage auction 9 years ago for less than the cost of a decent shuttle, and she had been flying it ever since through corridors that no modern shipping company would touch. The Varen Passage was one of those corridors. It was old space, the kind of space that had been charted, fought over, forgotten, and charted again so many times that the maps disagreed with each other depending on which decade they were printed. The asteroid fields were dense. The fold currents were unpredictable. Proper freight companies sent their ships around it. Hara sent hers through it, because through it was faster, and faster meant contracts, and contracts meant her crew got paid. The Resolute was not a pretty ship. It had never been pretty even when it was new, back in the days of the First Contact War when human engineers built warships to survive rather than to impress. Its hull was dark gray, patched in a dozen places with plating that did not quite match the original. Its engines made a sound on startup that new crew members always found alarming, until De La Obi explained that the sound was normal and the silence would be the thing to worry about. Its corridors smelled like recycled air and machine oil, and the particular kind of tired that comes from a vessel that has been running without rest for too long. Hara loved it the way you love something that has never let you down. She was in the lower cargo bay checking the medical supply manifest when Rafe Nkosi's voice came through the ship intercom with the flat tone he used when he was trying not to sound concerned. He told her she needed to come up. He said there was something on the long-range scan that was not on any of their charts. She took the ladder rather than the lift, because the lift on that deck had been making a grinding sound she had not yet had time to investigate, and arrived on the bridge in under 2 minutes. What the scan showed was not one ship, it was 11. They were arranged in a formation that Hara recognized from old tactical manuals. A command vessel at the center, 2 heavy escort ships flanking it, 4 mid-range attack craft spread in a forward arc, and 4 lighter pursuit ships positioned at the outer edges to cut off retreat. It was a corridor seizure formation. She had read about it but never seen one used in her lifetime, because the Treaty of the Varen Accord had theoretically made such formations illegal in neutral space. Theoretically, the ships were Dravki. She could tell from the hull geometry, long and smooth with that particular forward sweep at the bow that the Dravki preferred, their running lights a cold blue that made them look like something frozen and dangerous drifting through the dark. Rafe told her they were broadcasting on the open channel. She told him to put it through. The voice that came over the channel was calm and formal and deeply unconcerned. It introduced itself as Fleet Commander Sarath of the Dravki Territorial Authority. It informed her that the Varen Passage had been reclassified as a contested zone under a provision she had never heard of. It told her that all non-Dravki vessels were required to heave to, submit to inspection, and await escort out of the corridor. Non-compliance, the voice said, would result in the disabling of her vessel. The voice paused there, as if expecting a response that involved fear. Hara looked at the scan for a long moment. 11 ships. The smallest of them was newer and better armed than anything she was carrying. Their combined firepower could reduce the Resolute to debris in under 4 minutes if they coordinated properly. She clicked the channel open. She told Commander Sarath that she was carrying medical supplies bound for the Yithrani settlement on the far side of the passage, that the Varen Accord made humanitarian cargo exempt from interdiction regardless of zone classification, and that she would be continuing on her current heading. There was a pause from the other end. Then Sarath's voice came back, and this time there was something different in it. Not anger, amusement. He said something to someone on his bridge that did not get translated, and there was a sound from his crew that might have been laughter. Then he addressed her again and said that her ship's registry listed it as a pre-treaty warship class, which meant it was over 40 years old, and that given its condition he was surprised it was still flying at all. He told her this would be quick and painless if she cooperated. Hara clicked off the channel. She looked at her crew, Rafe at the gunner station, Pella Annam at navigation, young Cass at communications, wide-eyed but steady. And through the intercom she knew Delau was already in the maintenance shafts because Delau was always in the maintenance shafts when something was about to happen, as if the ship told her things through its pipes and wiring before it told anyone else. Hara did not give a speech. She never gave speeches. She just said one word. Stations. And the Resolute, old and ugly and full of people who had nowhere else to be, turned slowly to face 11 warships in the dark. The first shot was not a weapon, it was a message. The Dravki fired a single suppression burst across the Resolute's bow, close enough that it lit up the bridge windows in cold blue light, far enough that it was clearly a warning rather than an attack. It was the kind of shot that said, "We are being patient with you." It was the kind of shot that assumed the other side would respond to patience with compliance. Hara did not comply. She told Pella to take them into the debris field along the passage's northern edge, slow and steady, nothing that looked like a run. Pella, who had been navigating tight corridors since she was a teenager on her family's mining hauler, did not ask why. She just moved her hands and the Resolute shifted course with the slow, groaning weight of something very large that had been doing this for a very long time. The Dravki fleet adjusted. They spread wider, plugging the obvious exit routes. Sareth's voice came back over the open channel, still patient, still faintly amused. He told her that she was making this more complicated than it needed to be. He told her his long-range scans had a full read on her vessel. He knew her engine configuration, her weapon mounts, her shield rating. He said his analysts were almost embarrassed by how straightforward this was. Hara did not respond. Down in the maintenance shafts, Delau was already 3 junctions deep into the ship's secondary power grid, moving by memory in the dark because she had walked these paths so many times she did not need light. The Resolute had been built during a war where the enemy always tried to knock out power first. So the engineers who designed it had not put the power core where any reasonable person would look for it. They had buried the primary distribution nodes inside a false bulkhead in the forward cargo section, wrapped in sensor-deadening insulation that made them invisible to standard scans. The secondary nodes were threaded through the ship's structural frame itself, hidden in the bones of the vessel. No modern scanner would find them because no modern scanner was looking for something that old. Delau reached the junction she wanted and began rerouting. She was pulling power away from the external sensor array, which the Dravki were almost certainly using to track the ship's internal systems, and redistributing it through the hull-mounted communication grid. It was an old trick from the war. It made the ship look less active than it was. It also let Delau feed false readings to anyone scanning from outside. On the bridge, Cass told Hara something interesting. The Dravki scans were bouncing back readings that were 40 years out of date. They were seeing the ship as it had been registered, not as it was now. That was the thing about old ships that people who had never flown one did not understand. Over 40 years of repair and modification, a vessel stopped matching its original specs entirely. The Resolute had been refitted 11 times. It carried systems that were not on any manifest because Hara had installed them herself from salvage, from surplus, from things she had pulled out of other old ships before those ships were finally broken down for parts. Some of those systems were so old they existed in no current database. Some of them had never existed in any alien database because they had been designed during a war that ended before most of the galactic community had ever met a human. The Dravki fleet thought they knew what they were dealing with. They did not know what they were dealing with. Sareth gave a second warning. His tone had shifted slightly, the amusement thinning. He did not like that the human ship had moved without seeming to panic. He did not like that it had not responded to his second transmission. In his experience, small vessels with no realistic chance of survival became very talkative very quickly once they understood their situation. This one was quiet. He ordered 2 of his escort ships to move up on the Resolute's flanks and begin active targeting locks. Not to fire, just to make sure she could feel the guns on her. In the gunner station, Rafe felt them. The targeting lock signals lit up on his board, 2 of them, one on each side. His screen was cracked across the lower left corner, had been for 2 years, and the crack bisected one of the readout columns in a way that made it slightly annoying to read. He had learned to read around it. He tracked both lock signatures with the ease of someone who had been doing this since before the crack existed. He asked Hara over the internal channel if they were doing this. She told him not yet. She said to wait until they were inside the debris field. Rafe acknowledged and went back to watching his board. He was not nervous, or if he was, it had settled into something beneath the surface that did not affect his hands. His hands were perfectly still. Outside, the debris field drew closer. Broken rock and old metal and the frozen remnants of a mining operation that had shut down before Hara was born. Dense enough to scatter scans, dense enough to hide in. The Dravki escorts followed them in. That was the mistake. Modern ships were built for open space. They were designed around the assumption that combat happened at range, that sensors could see clearly, that targeting systems had clean lines of calculation. When Sareth's escort captains followed the Resolute into the debris field, they brought their modern assumptions with them. They did not know that the Resolute had been built for exactly this kind of space. It had fought in the asteroid belts of the Kellen system. It had hunted and been hunted through the debris rings of dying stations. Its targeting systems were calibrated for noise and clutter. Its armor was rated for impact from objects that were not weapons. Its crew knew how to fly it blind. The Resolute disappeared into the rocks. And then it turned around. Rafe did not fire at the ships. He fired at the rocks. It was a thing that made no sense if you were thinking like a modern gunner. Modern weapons were precise. Modern tactics were built around precision. You targeted the engine, the shield generator, the command section. You did not waste a shot on an asteroid. But Rafe was not wasting anything. The Resolute carried mass drivers in its secondary battery, old rail-based launchers that fired dense metal slugs at speeds that modern point defense systems were not calibrated to handle, because modern point defense systems were designed to intercept energy weapons and guided munitions, not unguided chunks of accelerated metal. The slugs themselves were not impressive by any current standard. They were simple and dumb and old. But when one of those slugs hit a 300-ton asteroid at high velocity, the asteroid did not stay where it was. The first shot sent a boulder the size of a transport shuttle spinning sideways into the path of the nearer escort ship. The escort captain had maybe 2 seconds to react. He reacted well, pulling his ship hard to port, and avoided a direct collision, but the edge of the rock caught his starboard sensor array and tore it completely away. The second shot did not hit anything. It was not meant to. It went wide and struck a smaller cluster of debris that exploded outward in a spray of rock and frozen gas, filling a wide section of the field with clutter that made targeting impossible for anything relying on modern scan systems. The third shot hit the farther escort directly, not because Rafe was lucky, because he had spent the last 90 seconds watching how that ship moved, learning its correction patterns, and calculating where it would be rather than where it was. The slug caught the escort's port engine housing. The explosion was not enormous. It was contained and violent and very specifically damaging. The escort ship did not break apart. Its engine died. It began to drift. On Sareth's command bridge, 3 things happened almost simultaneously. His sensor officer reported that the nearer escort was damaged and had lost its external scanning capability. His tactical officer reported that long-range targeting of the human vessel was impossible due to debris scatter, and his communications officer reported that the human ship had still not broadcast a single word since refusing compliance. Soreth stood up. In 40 years of fleet command, he had not stood up during an engagement. He was a disciplined officer. He stayed in his chair. But he stood up now, not from alarm, or not only from alarm, but because something about this situation had stopped making sense and he needed to think standing up. The human ship was old. His scans said it was old. His intelligence files said it was old. He had access to the full registry record of the UHS Resolute, and it painted a picture of a pre-treaty warship that had been stripped of most of its military systems before being sold to private use. It was supposed to have 2 functioning weapon mounts, civilian grade, good for warning shots against pirates, not for taking out military escort vessels. His tactical officer was explaining what had happened with the mass driver shots, and Soreth listened, and when the explanation was finished, he asked where the mass drivers appeared in the Resolute's weapon registry. His tactical officer checked, then checked again, then said they did not appear in the registry at all. Soreth asked how that was possible. His tactical officer said it was possible if the weapons had been installed after the registry was filed, using parts that were not cataloged in any current system. Soreth sat back down. He had 9 ships that were fully functional. He had 2 that were damaged. The human ship was somewhere inside a debris field that his sensors could not penetrate cleanly, and it had just demonstrated that it could hit things his targeting systems could not even locate properly. He thought about pulling back out of the debris field and waiting for it to come out on its own. Then the Resolute came out on its own, and it was not moving away from his fleet. It was moving toward it. Not fast, not charging. It moved with a kind of slow, deliberate weight, like something that had decided the distance between itself and the threat needed to close rather than grow. Hara was not giving Soreth the long-range engagement he wanted. She was taking it short. Rafe switched battery systems. The mass drivers were for the debris field. Out here he had something else. The Resolute carried a close-range particle scatter system that had no common name in any current tactical manual, because the technology had been considered obsolete and removed from service before most current warship designers were born. It did not punch through shields. It degraded them slowly in a wide arc, like sandpaper rather than a drill. Against any modern warship with regenerating shield systems, it was essentially useless at range. At close range, over sustained fire, it was a different question. Modern shield generators were not built to sustain degradation. They were built to absorb spikes. The Resolute had fought enemies that knew this about human shields and had built their own weapons around that knowledge. So human engineers had developed the scatter system to answer that tactic. It was, in essence, a 40-year-old solution to a 40-year-old problem. Soreth's ships had never encountered the problem, which meant they had never developed a solution. Rafe opened the scatter system and swept it across the 3 nearest Dravki warships in a slow, wide arc. Nothing dramatic happened. No explosions. No visible effect that anyone on the Dravki side would immediately recognize as damage. But under the surface, in the layered field generators of 3 modern warships, something was beginning to wear. Hara gave Soreth 30 seconds to see what was happening before she offered him another way out. He did not take it. She had not expected him to, not yet. Soreth had been patient long enough. He pulled his remaining 9 ships into a compressed attack formation and opened up with full offensive fire. Not suppression, not warning shots, everything. He decided that the cost of hesitation was higher than the cost of force, and that whatever strange tricks this old vessel was carrying, volume of fire was the answer to strange tricks. The Resolute took it. Not easily. The first volley hit the ship across the port side and buckled two outer hull plates. A power conduit on Deck 3 ruptured, and the corridor filled with superheated gas before the emergency bulkhead sealed. One crew member caught the edge of the rupture and went down hard, conscious but unable to move her left arm. Cass, at communications, took a thrown piece of internal debris across the side of her face and kept working with blood on her collar. Dulla felt the ship take the hit through the metal around her. She was deep in the structural frame by then, past the maintenance shafts, in the spaces between the ribs of the ship where no one went except her. She knew the Resolute's pain the way you know the pain of something you have lived inside for years. She felt where it hurt. She moved toward it. The second Druvki volley was more coordinated. Sareth was pressing the advantage, assuming that a ship taking that kind of fire was a ship running out of options. His tactical officer was confirming shield degradation on the Resolute's aft section. His weapons officer was calling out targeting solutions on the engine housings. It looked, from the Druvki side, like the end of something. From the Resolute's side, it looked like the moment they had been building toward. Hara had not been holding the scatter system running for 3 minutes because it was doing nothing. She had been running it because it took 3 minutes to do what she needed it to do. Modern shields did not fail like old shields. Old shields had weak points, stress fractures, degradation zones you could find and exploit. Modern shields were homogeneous, self-correcting, and nearly impossible to crack through a single concentrated attack. But 3 minutes of particle scatter at close range did not crack them. It wore them thin everywhere, all at once, evenly, so that when the failure came it was not a breach in one spot. It was a systemic drop. 3 Druvki warships lost shield integrity in the same 4-second window. Ruff did not need to be told. He had been watching the readings on his cracked screen for 3 minutes, and he knew exactly when the window opened. He fired the main battery. The Resolute's primary weapons were heavy mass drivers, the large ones that were not in any registry because they had been pulled from a decommissioned warship that had been sold for scrap and should have had its weapons removed before the sale but had not, because the inspection process for 40-year-old decommissioned ships was not what it should have been. They were slow to cycle and loud, and they made the ship shudder when they fired. They were also very large and very heavy, and they hit 3 shield-down Druvki warships at point-blank range. 2 ships took critical damage to their forward sections and began venting atmosphere. Their crews survived, contained in sealed compartments by automatic emergency systems, but the ships were no longer combat-capable. A third ship took a hit amidships that tore through its main weapon housing and detonated something inside, producing a controlled internal explosion that the ship's own damage control systems fought for the next several minutes. Sareth's fleet had just lost 3 more ships in under 10 seconds. He had started this engagement with 11 ships. He was down to 6. Sareth did something then that surprised his own crew. He stopped giving orders. He sat in his chair and he looked at his display for a long time. The Resolute was still there, still moving, still targeting. It had taken serious damage. One section of its hull was dark. It was venting trace atmosphere from somewhere in its lower deck. By any modern assessment, it was a ship that should have been losing. His second in command, a young officer named Drusson who had graduated top of his academy class and had a methodical mind that Sareth had always valued, approached quietly and said that they still had superior numbers and that the human ship was clearly damaged. Sareth asked Drusson what the human ship had used to degrade their shields. Drusson checked with the tactical station and came back with the answer that the weapons system did not match any current profile in their database. Sareth asked if it was in any database. Drusson checked. It took longer this time. The answer was that there was a partial match in a historical archive, a system called a particle scatter array, listed as obsolete and removed from service by human military forces 38 years ago. Sareth asked why it was not in their countermeasure systems. Drusun said it was not in their countermeasure systems because it had been marked obsolete. There was no countermeasure for something that was no longer considered a threat. Sarath sat with that information. His 6 remaining ships were functional. The human vessel was damaged. A sustained second assault would likely destroy it. But his 3 disabled ships were drifting, their crews alive but helpless. And if the human captain had more systems that were not in any database, he did not know what the cost of that second assault would be. He asked Drusun how long it would take his engineering crews to build a countermeasure for the scatter array, working from the archive data. Drusun said 14 hours minimum. Outside, the Resolute held its position and waited. Hara opened the channel first. She had been waiting to see if Sarath would do it himself. He had not, which told her something about him. He was the kind of commander who did not like to be the one to speak after a defeat, even a partial one. He would sit in his chair and think and calculate and wait for a situation to change rather than accept that it had already changed. She recognized the type. She had served under 2 of them in the war. She clicked on the channel and told Sarath that she was reading 3 of his ships as non-functional and 2 more as combat degraded. She said that her medical officer could prep and transmit emergency response protocols to his damaged vessels if his crews needed guidance on treating injuries from decompression exposure. She said this without condition and without asking anything in return. There was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough to be meaningful. Then Sarath said that his crews did not require assistance. Hara said that was fine and that the offer remained open. Another silence. Then Sarath asked how she intended to proceed. She told him she intended to proceed on her original heading, through the passage, to deliver her cargo. She told him she had no interest in his fleet's destruction or his crew's deaths. She told him she had a Yuthrani settlement waiting on medical supplies, and she intended to get those supplies there. Sarath asked why she had not simply said that at the beginning. She told him she had. Another silence, longer this time. What Sarath was doing during those silences, though Hara could not see it, was talking to his intelligence officer, a quiet woman named Vus who had said almost nothing during the engagement but who had been running searches and analysis the entire time. Vus had pulled everything available on the UHS Resolute, the public registry, the partial military records that had been declassified, the sale documents from the salvage auction, the cargo manifests from 9 years of private operation. The Resolute had made 42 runs through difficult corridors in 9 years. It had been boarded twice by pirates, both times resulting in the pirates being contained and handed over to the nearest authority. It had pulled 3 disabled vessels out of dangerous situations and asked for no salvage fee. It had a record of carrying humanitarian cargo that, when Vus added it up, was substantial enough to be remarkable for a private vessel of its size. It had never fired on another ship first, in any of its 42 runs, not once. Vus laid this information in front of Sarath quietly. He read it, he did not say anything. His tactical officer was still building the case for a second assault. The numbers favored it. 6 functional ships against 1 damaged vessel. The probability calculation said a sustained, coordinated attack would destroy the Resolute before it could effectively respond. His tactical officer was not wrong about the numbers. Sarath looked at Drusun and asked him what the tactical officer's probability calculation assumed about the human ship's remaining weapon systems. Drusun said it assumed they had been fully cataloged. Sarath asked if they had been. Drusun admitted they had not. That was the question Sarath had been sitting with since the shields went down. He knew his enemy's strength when he entered this engagement, or he had thought he knew it. He had been wrong about the mass drivers in the debris field. He had been wrong about the particle scatter system. He did not know what else was on that ship because the ship's actual configuration was not in any database and the humans were not telling him. Fighting an enemy you could not fully read was a different kind of problem than fighting a weaker enemy. You could win against a weaker enemy almost automatically if the numbers were right. You could not automatically win against an unknown one, because the unknown ones reserved the right to surprise you at the moment you could least afford to be surprised. Sorath's instinct, honed by 4 decades of fleet command, told him that the captain of the Resolute had not yet used everything she had. He asked Voss if the human vessel's humanitarian cargo was verified. Voss said the manifest was filed with 3 separate authorities and the medical supply codes matched active shortage records from the Ythrani settlement. It was real. The supplies were real. The need on the other end was real. Sorath pulled up the Varen Accord on his personal screen and read the humanitarian exemption clause. He read it twice. Then he read the provision his territorial authority had cited when reclassifying the passage as a contested zone. He compared the two. He called his legal officer. The legal officer confirmed, somewhat carefully, that the humanitarian exemption in the Accord predated the territorial reclassification provision by 60 years, and that in cases of conflict between the two, precedent in 11 previous cases favored the exemption. What that meant, in plain terms, was that the Resolute had been correct from the beginning. It had the right to be in this corridor. It had the right to pass. Sorath had started an engagement. He had no legal basis to start. He sat with that for a moment as well. Then he opened the channel himself and told Hara that his fleet would provide a navigational escort to the Resolute through the remainder of the passage to ensure safe passage for humanitarian cargo in accordance with the Accord. There was a pause from her end. Then she said that would be appreciated. He closed the channel and told Dressen to bring the fleet into escort formation around the human ship. He told his engineering crews to begin recovery operations on the 3 disabled vessels. He told his medical teams to quietly transmit those emergency response protocols that had been offered, just in case. He did not tell anyone that he was going to spend the next several days writing a report that he was not looking forward to writing, or that he intended to recommend a full review of the territorial reclassification provision, or that he had decided he needed to read more about the First Contact War. He told himself those were separate matters. The Resolute moved. His fleet moved around it. Outside the command viewport, he could see the old ship up close for the first time, its battered hull, its mismatched plating, the dark section where it had taken damage and sealed itself. It was an ugly ship. It had no elegance. It looked like something that had been fixed so many times it had forgotten what it originally looked like. It was still flying. He found he could not stop looking at it. The Ythrani settlement had no docking bay large enough for the Resolute. It had been built for smaller ships, supply runners and personal craft, the kind of vessels that serviced a colony of 400 people living on a rock that nobody important had bothered to think about in years. The Resolute came in close and used its cargo ejection system to send the medical containers down on tether lines, one at a time, each one guided in by Pella from the navigation seat, while Hara watched through the viewport and Delam monitored the tether tension from below. It took 4 hours. It was not elegant, it worked. The settlement administrator came on the channel when the last container landed. Her name was Ori, and she had a voice that sounded like someone who had been holding tension in her chest for a long time and had just been told she could let it go. She asked if the ship had been in some kind of engagement. She had picked up residual weapon signatures on her sensors. Hara told her there had been a navigational disagreement that had been resolved. Ori said that the medical supplies included 3 specific compounds that had been marked critical for 6 weeks. She said that 2 of her people were in serious condition and had been waiting on those compounds. She asked how soon they could be administered. Hara patched her through to the ship's medical officer, a quiet man named Fenn who had been treating Cass's facial wound, and the crew member with the damaged arm while all the other things were happening, because Fenn was the kind of person who treated what needed treating regardless of what else was going on. Fenn talked Ori's medical team through the administration process for the next 2 hours. The Dravki escort fleet held position outside the settlement's sensor range the entire time. They did not speak, they did not approach, they waited. When the Resolute finally pulled away from the settlement and began its return through the passage, Sareth's fleet moved with it in a loose formation, and when they reached the edge of the corridor, Sareth opened the channel one final time. He said that the escort was concluded. Hara thanked him. He started to close the channel and then did not. There was a pause. Then he asked a question that was clearly not an official question. He asked how old the Resolute was. She told him it had been commissioned 43 years ago. She said she had owned it for 9. He asked if she had served on it during the First Contact War. She said she had served on a different ship during the war. She said she had bought the Resolute because it was what she could afford, and because she recognized what it was when she saw it. He asked what she meant by that. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said it was a ship that had been built by people who expected to lose and decided to make it as hard as possible anyway. She said she found that useful. There was a silence. Sareth said he would file a report recommending the passage be returned to full neutral status, pending a review of the territorial provision. She said she would appreciate that. He said the review would take time. She said most things worth doing did. He closed the channel. The Resolute moved out of the passage alone. Behind it, the Dravki fleet turned and began its own return journey, 3 of its ships still under tow from the others, the tow cables stretching through the dark like threads connecting broken things to whatever would carry them home. On the Resolute, Rafe took his hands off the gunner controls for the first time in 9 hours and let his shoulders drop. He pulled the tape off the joystick grip and looked at it for a moment and then put it in his pocket. He would retape it later. He always did. Cass had a bandage across her cheekbone and was already composing the cargo delivery confirmation to send to the contractors. Her hands were steady. She had cried once briefly while Fenn was treating her, and then had stopped and gone back to work, which was the thing you did on a ship like the Resolute. Delac came up from the maintenance shafts 2 hours after the engagement ended, as she usually did, covered in grease and looking like someone who had been somewhere much more difficult than anyone else on the ship. She went to the small galley, made herself a drink, and sat down at the crew table and did not say anything for a while. Eventually, she said that the portside power conduit that had ruptured would need a proper replacement at the next port. She said she had patched it, but the patch was not going to hold indefinitely. Hara said they would sort it at Mevari Station on the way back. Delan nodded and drank her drink. Pella set a return course. The ship settled into its normal sounds, the engine hum that new crew always found alarming, the creak of old metal, the particular rhythm of recycled air moving through passages that had been carrying it for 4 decades. Somewhere far behind them, in the communications logs of the Galactic Council's neutral monitoring station for the Varen Passage, an automatic system had recorded the entire engagement. Flag, file, forward. Standard procedure. A human private vessel, pre-treaty class, had refused interdiction by 11 Dravki warships, disabled 5 of them, and then delivered humanitarian cargo to a critical settlement. The file sat in a queue for 3 days before a council analyst opened it. When she did, she read it twice. Then she pulled the Resolute's registry file. Then she sat back in her chair for a long time. Then she forwarded it to her supervisor with a note that said simply, "You should read this." The Resolute did not know about any of that. It was already 2 days into the return journey, moving through open space with its running lights flickering the way they always did when the power grid was stressed, its battered hull carrying 28 people and no cargo toward the next job, the next corridor, the next thing that needed doing. It flew the way it always flew, like it had no intention of stopping.